I'd first like to acknowledge the people who first inhabited this territory, the Seneca First Nations. To be able to spend time in a remote fly-in reserve, to live with a Native family in their home, and to experience their lifestyle firsthand. This was the invitation sent out to Canadians by the youth in KI. Their youth leader, Justin Beardy, made it clear, we want people to come and see our living conditions and the hope that we still have. I saw this in the Toronto Star in May, and I thought it's one thing to be able to read things and see documentaries, but to actually have the opportunity to live in the culture and experience the day-to-day life was something I just had to do. And so I invite everybody to hop on board with me to my trip to KI. Slide, please. KI is short for Kitchenuhmaykoosib Inninuwug, which means people of Big Trout Lake, waters flowing into Hudson's Bay. It's situated 600 kilometers north of Thunder Bay and 300 kilometers south of Hudson's Bay, and we were in 1 hour behind Toronto there because it's closer to the Manitoba border. Next slide, please. This is Post Island, where the reserve is situated. It's on the northern side of Big Trout Lake, and it's joined by a causeway to the mainland. It's a fly-in community for 10 months of the year, and then there's an ice road, but it's a 17-hour drive from Thunder Bay to KI, non-stop drive. There's about 1,200 people in the community that's situated, as I say, on Post Island. And in 2004, some human bones were discovered on the edge of the lake on a ridge, and they were taken to Thunder Bay for testing, and it was discovered they were 5,000 years old. These people are not new to Canada. Next slide, please. This is youth leader Justin Beardy. We were pretty much brought to tears when he greeted us in the Thunder Bay airport in the lounge. Justin explained to us how in this January, they first thought of bringing people from the south up to the northern remote community. And in March, they knew they had to make a decision. Do we go ahead or leave it for a year? And so they asked themselves, well, what would success look like? And they thought if just one person answered the invitation, that would be success. So when he stood in the waiting lounge and saw 43 Canadians cared enough to accept their invitation, he could barely speak. It was a very moving moment for all of us to think that, we're all total strangers, and yet it meant so much to the community. And we were a mixed group. We were all different ages and from all different backgrounds. Next slide, please. On the right is Chief Georgianne Morrisseau. She is the 28-year-old Chief of Fort William Reserve, and she greeted us warmly in the airport also. And she gave us a very helpful reminder that not everybody starts out life in the same place. Very helpful words as we started out on this unique journey. With her are other Native women from her reserve, and they played the drums when we had our first round dance in the lounge in Thunder Bay Airport as we waited for our next leg of the trip to KI. And it was her hope, though, Georgianne's hope, that we would gain some real insight as we spent the week there, and that this would help foster some serious change for people living on reserves everywhere. Next slide, please. This is Chief Donnie Morris of KI, and he greeted us in the Commons area when we arrived up there. He was very clear that there would be no sugarcoating or whitewashing of things while we spent the week there. He said, we have our day-to-day struggles, but we get along. He had no expectations for us other than that we just be and absorb and get a sense of the place over the week. And we were all very pleased to see how proud he and the council were of the young people that had put this together, and here we were, we'd made it. Next slide, please. I don't know whether you can see the eagle on top. I saw 5 eagles out on the lake while we were there. This was one amazing experience this week. The community just opened its arms to us. They fed us. They took us places. They couldn't do enough. They gave up their beds for us. I mean, this is a very overcrowded community. In the home that I stayed in, 10 people lived in that home, and Faith gave up her bed, slept on a mattress on the floor, and some of the kids moved out to other friends' homes. But there was a lot of laughter during the week. There was a jigging contest and square dancing, and we were just thrilled with the sight of the Northern Lights one evening, and the crystal clear waters of the lake. You can see right to the bottom. It's all sandy and golden sugar brown beaches everywhere. It was beautiful. Next slide, please. This is Sandy Banks. It's the community's favorite place on the lake. It's about a 20-minute drive from the island. I didn't brave going down. Some of the younger people did. I enjoyed the scenery from the top. Next slide, please. These are the older women in the community. There's 2 Anglican churches, and these ladies sang hymns around the bonfire at Sandy Banks. Next slide, please. And this is just another view. Everywhere you look, there's water and evergreens in KI. It's a very beautiful place. Next slide, please. And we had a roaring bonfire with marshmallows and hot dogs and hot chocolate. And then someone brought out the drum, and we had a round dance at the top of the cliff. And then they surprised us with a beautiful display of fireworks. It's an evening none of us will ever forget. Next slide, please. There were many opportunities to see many different things around KI over the week, depending on our interests. For instance, let's see. There was a tour of the medical center, the school, the family and child welfare center, the addiction treatment center and group home. The new community garden was open to us, and the water treatment center. This is the rear of the addiction treatment center. It's a beautiful log building. And this is Annie she goes to Queens, and one of the photographers that spent the week with us. Next slide, please. This is the view of the lake from that wraparound veranda on the Addiction Treatment Center. Next slide, please. And we toured the group home. It was 20 years old, but they had spent a lot of money on it a couple of years ago, and it's a very bright, inviting place for anybody that has to go to an institution. Next slide. And the woodworking shop that they have. Next slide, please. There was so much to see and do, but I really wanted time to get to know the people that had hosted me, Joey and Sandra. Joey is in the green top in the center, and his wife Sandra is in the pink sweater next to him on the left, and the grandchildren to the left there. And sitting in front is young Faith. She's one of their daughters. And it was Faith, actually, that gave up her bed for us. And on the right is Marilyn and Jeff. They were also hosted by Sandra and Joey. Next slide, please. Joey took us out on the lake one afternoon for a couple of hours to a couple of beautiful islands and some of the favorite fishing areas. Next slide, please. This is one of the pretty islands where the seabirds, the terns, live and nest. Next slide, please. You can see there's rocky, there's every mixture on the lake. The whole top half of the lake, which is 36 miles long and 18 miles across. It's a big lake. Very pretty places. Next slide, please. This is Joey's family's favorite place to go. And it's somewhere where he went with his family when he was a small boy, spent a lot of time there in the summer. It's their traditional fishing grounds. And Joey's father taught him net fishing. And it gave me a lot of pleasure to know that when we left on the Friday, that Joey and his family were going out to the traditional fishing grounds. It was the hottest day that we had there on the Friday when we left, and that they were going to have a picnic dinner, and I'm sure the kids went swimming because school was now out. Their connection with the environment is absolutely palpable with their lands, and I always enjoy picturing them being, that's where I think of them, not in their home. I think of this lovely spot that he took us to. And these are two of our group, Marilyn and Christine, that were part of our tour. Next slide, please. This is Eva cooking up our first meal at the Commons. This is the Commons area where we ate all our meals. Breakfast started at 8 a.m. Next slide, please. The lake is full of fish, whitefish, walleye, pike, and two types of trout. Fish and moose actually make up at least a third of their diet in KI. It was delicious, just lightly floured and just not deep fried, just lightly fried. Next slide, please. This is a teepee just outside the school that we toured, and this lady is preparing Canada Goose, which I never thought I would try. The teepee was enormous, and it was a very, very hot day. Next slide, please. As you can see, they were cooking stew and some other meals in the center of the teepee, and there was about 12 or 14 of us touring through here. There was no smoke, and it was completely comfortable in there. It was really interesting to experience that. Next slide, please. This is a moose head. We had moose one evening. They dissected it down the jaw, like the head is really big, right? Next slide, please. This is the tongue. It's a delicacy, which they removed. And they boiled that later. Next slide, please. And here they're continuing to roast the moose head over the fire. There's apparently a tremendous amount of meat on the nose, and they carved it later and made it into a delicious stew. We were very well fed at KI. There was fresh bannock, hot fresh bannock at every meal. We really indulged ourselves. Lots of us made new little friends. In the center is Zoe in the gray patterned dress, and she and a friend met us at the airport when we arrived and then rode on the bus with us into the Commons. And then later that day, Zoe came running up to me at the table and wanted to know, would I be living with them? Would I be going to her graduation? And would I be her kokum, which is OG Cree for grandma. Lots of us made new little friends like this over the week, and they often tagged around with us to the different tours that we made. So I was delighted because the next day all of us went to the school graduation. Next slide, please. Here she just graduated from grade 2. Next slide, please. The grade 7s demonstrated the robot after they had their little ceremony. They made this over the year, and you can see it has a baton on the front of it and has some kind of sensor because they put like a big tape on the floor and it would follow it around. Next slide, please. Best of all, if you put a native drum in front of it, it beat the drum. This actually is young Tyler, one of the youth there, demonstrating it for the Lieutenant Governor and Governor General's wives on our last day of celebration at KI. Everybody was properly impressed with the way they incorporated traditional and modern teachings for the grade 7s. Next slide, please. Drumming and round dances followed most of our evening meals, and it was a great way to help us to get to know everybody. The music very much played an important part, like it does here in our services. Next slide, please. It was a huge surprise to us to see that they had lost drumming in KI. They didn't have it anymore. With the coming of the fur traders in the 16 and 1700s and the introduction of Christianity, then in the 1800s, the missionaries and residential schools and all the Indian Act, their culture was decimated. However, thankfully, this young chap, Phil, he's from Six Nations in Brantford. A couple of years ago, he went up to the Visit KI and taught the young people drumming. He's visited several times. Next slide, please. The youth really did an amazing job. This was when the Lieutenant Governors and Governor General's wives were with us for our closing. You could see that the drumming really gave the youth a purpose, and it connected them to their traditional teachings. Now, an interesting twist on that is Joey, who hosted us, told me that they didn't drum in KI, and I wondered, what on earth do you mean you don't drum? But he explained that in OG Cree tradition, only the shaman or the medicine man drummed, and so that was considered sacred, and a number of the community would not come out when the youth are drumming because they felt it went against their traditions. I found that really interesting because it's a deeply Christian community. There's a couple of Anglican churches and at least 3 evangelical or Pentecostal churches there. Change is difficult. Next slide, please. This is Chief Donnie Morris. Let me see, where did I get here? He's been chief for 17 years in KI. He's highly respected, and Joey told me that's extremely rare in First Nations. The chief and council spent a lot of time one afternoon telling us of their future plans, which were very impressive for their nation. The chief also was clear that although they were unhappy with the circumstances in which Treaty 9 had been presented to them in 1929, due to the lack of English of the native leaders of the time, he now envisioned a future of hope, friendship, peace, and respect between our nations. Next slide, please. On the right is Daryl Sanich, and he's just 31 years old. He's a deputy chief, and he's been with the council for 7 years. And this is Sam McKay to his left, one of the councillors. They're in for 2 years, voted in for 2 years. And we were really impressed with all the wisdom that came from these people. Next slide, please. Looking ahead, this is Jeff, and he was billeted with us at Joey and Sandra's, and he'd been out on the lake fishing that night. He said it took about 20-30 minutes to get to the fishing area, and there were 6 people in the boat. They dropped their lines in 10 minutes. They all had a beautiful catch. I'm sure many of us would like to experience that. But looking ahead, the council told us the band is aiming to open up commercial fishing and tourism, and that these industries will be under their own control. The people have used these lands over the centuries, and it's meant their well-being, and they need to find ways to be able to continue to do that. And so with the tourism in mind and whatnot, they're planning on opening up 3 roads into some of the remote lakes. Next slide, please. This is the plane that brought me up from Thunder Bay. It's a 26-seater. It's Wasaya Airlines, and there are 12 First Nations up in the north, some in Manitoba, some in Ontario, that have a part ownership in Wasaya Airlines. And in the summer, Wasaya offers a course on aviation. It's an aviation camp to 30 Native youth from ages 13 to 15, and it's done in conjunction with one of the colleges in Thunder Bay. Next slide, please. This is the general store on Post Island. It's also got an ATM for CIBC and a post office. We visited one of the native stores on the mainland called Stan's, which has been in business for 18 months and already expanding. The Hudson's Bay is no longer there. In its place are 3 general stores and 2 convenience stores, all owned and operated by the native people. Next slide, please. This is just up the road from Stan's on the mainland. They made this clearing this spring and have planted root vegetables and some beans, and it's going to be a real boon to the community, because, fresh produce at much cheaper prices. The prices of food in KR are staggering. It's terrible. We're hoping that others in the community will see what a good idea this is and open up other gardening areas everywhere. The Band Council is hoping to bring in a sawmill to build log homes for the community, and they'll use locally accessed lumber, which you see everywhere you look. This will mean it'll be a reduced cost of construction, it'll employ youth and transfer marketable skills, and it'll provide desperately needed homes to the people in KI. Homes that will withstand temperatures that can, in the winter, -40 and in the summer +40. One band member has done something, it's a first in KI, and I could feel the other Native people kind of watching and thinking, this is interesting, not in any malicious way, but it's really got their attention, because he went to Thunder Bay and got a loan and had his own home built. And it's just up the road from the garden. It's a modest bungalow with clad in aluminum, and he's renting out rooms to pay the mortgage. When he had the land cleared for his home, he also had a large space next to it cleared, which he's hoping to build a motel in the future. He's thinking ahead with the tourism and whatnot that they're planning for. So we saw these all as enormous hopes for the future of KI. Next slide, please. This is the water treatment plant. Their water is brought in somehow from the lake. It's only treated with chlorine, nothing else. Next slide, please. We have graffiti up. There's graffiti everywhere, isn't there? But this is Annie. She is a teacher in Ottawa, part of our group, and she's in front of the truck fill garage, which is, where they fill up the truck with water. The homes on Post Island have piped in water, but on the mainland, they deliver water to the home. I wanted to tell you a little bit about band budgets. They are dictated and controlled by the Federal Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development in the South. Funding for reserves is sent out monthly with no communication or input from the bands. They don't get any say on how the money will be divided up. The ministry specifies 4 areas: economic development, education, infrastructure, and administration. The government dictates what percentage must be spent in each of these 4 silos. So even if there's more money in one, they can't move it over to another. For instance, for housing, there's a huge shortage of housing there. If you want to build homes and there's extra money in administration, they cannot bring it over because they have to sign a directive each month for each of these areas, send it back to Ottawa in order to get funding for next month. Because the infrastructure, there's only an infrastructure fund to draw down housing from, they don't specify a housing fund, Ottawa doesn't. And infrastructure is already paying for roads, hydro, sewage, you name it. So they're only able to manage to build 3 to 4 homes a year, and there's 200 people on a waiting list for homes in KI. They also regularly have people coming to the band office asking for help for repairs to their homes, but the funding's already been allotted. There's no help. Next slide, please. This is a typical home built in the 60s in KI. They're prefab, all the homes are sent up prefab. They're just wooden boxes built for the South, and they deteriorate very quickly. Now this home, I was inside, and it is comfortable inside, but you can see the beating it takes from the extreme weather conditions there. They're just not made for that climate. One home that we visited had been condemned by council, which is a difficult decision given so many people need houses. The main room in the home served as living room, cooking, and eating area. There was 1 bedroom and a washroom. It had been heated with a wood stove, and there were no doors on the rooms. It had a serious problem with mold throughout, which is a problem on the reserve in the housing. There was no electricity or running water. It had a tank that you could draw water down from. In the washroom was a bucket with a plastic bag, and that was the toilet. Next slide, please. One of our group, this is just a general, give you an idea of what it looks like there. It's very sandy, and the roads are really they heave with the huge difference in temperature in the winter. One of our group visited a woman and her 4 children who were living in a trailer in the south. The place would have been condemned. It was full of mold, was heated with a wooden stove, and from the soot on the ceiling was obviously leaking. And if you put a glass of water on the counter beside that wood stove in the winter, it would freeze solid. And there's 30 homes like that in KI. Next slide, please. We visited the repair shop. This is one of 4 trucks they have in KI. They were able to get a couple of new ones a couple of years ago, and they move the water and they collect the sewage. And so we asked John, who had brought us there, which is this truck, and he said, I don't know, I think they keep them separate. They love to make jokes there. We're always laughing. However, 2 of the main problems besides housing facing the band in KI are sewage treatment and hydro supply. The sewage treatment plant is the most basic. It's a lagoon in the lake with 2 cells, and they cart the sewage and it's deposited there, and it sits for 2 years, and then it's released into the lake. It should have been upgraded 10 years ago, and it's overflowing. The other thing is hydro's at 85% capacity, and I mean, they need to build more homes. They have the plans for the log homes coming along, but they're not able to support these homes. You take the money from one place. If you fix these types of things, the sewage and the hydro, well, then there's no money for homes. You can't support them, and it's just an ongoing struggle, and things are slowly going to be grinding to a halt. Next slide, please. This is one of the classrooms in the school. The 2 people in front are part of our group. The gentleman back is a native teacher, and he's just packing up. As I say, it was the last day of school when we went through. The principal is also native, and there are other native teachers in the school. Next slide, please. This is the junior and senior kindergarten room. Next slide, please. And the school bus, which did yeoman service at Carter's everywhere over the week. Since it was the youth that brought us to KI, I thought we'd talk a little bit about their experiences. The federal government, again, is in charge of funding for schools on reservations, and they only give approximately half to the students on reserves that they give to that those in provincial schools get. This means there's gaps in curriculum, there's a lack of equipment, no librarian, and no computers in the classrooms, and a lack of teachers. The teachers in KI are paid $20,000 less than what their peers would get in Thunder Bay. The classrooms are full to overflowing, mean that once the students complete grade 10, they have to go either to Sioux Lookout or Thunder Bay for high school. This means leaving their homes, their families, their communities behind. It's a terrible stress. Once they get there, unfortunately, more often than not, they find they're 2 to 3 grades below what their peers are who have gone to a provincial school. It's a second-class system due to lack of funding. This, as you can imagine, this makes an enormous challenge for people, not just on KI, but youth on all reserves who are trying to get higher education. That being said, I have a news bulletin from since I got back. 2 of the young women in KI, they had gone through grade 10 there. They came down recently and had a visit with Trent University in Peterborough. And they have been accepted to university in the fall there if they can manage to get the funding. Naturally, they have some real concerns about their grade levels, but Trent University has a wonderful bridging program that would help see them through. Anyway, we are just so happy for them. I hope that it becomes a reality. Next slide, please. For all their hope, there are a number of negatives we cannot ignore. There are from 1 to 5 deaths each month in KI, and some of them may be from suicide. When someone dies, it costs $20,000 to ship the body to Thunder Bay to be seen by a coroner, to be examined, death certificate issued, embalmed, and then returned for burial in KI. The government pays $1,400 of this, so how the KI band manages it, they deduct 3% off of everyone's salary and set that money aside for this expensive process. You see, there isn't a doctor in KI all the time. Medical care is inadequate. 6 nurses rotate shifts. There's a doctor that flies in about once every 3 weeks, and a dentist comes in from time to time, and it was obvious that there's a need for more dental care in the community. The ambulance service, though, is run by volunteers in the community. However, there's a high burnout with care workers in this community. The same issues keep coming up over and over again, and there's no money for professionals to give debriefing programs, which would be very much needed. And care workers also, they have a hard time. They get burnt out because it's a small community, and often they're touched by what they're dealing with. Crushing boredom and isolation, loss of cultural identity, coping with developing world conditions, and the pressures of encroaching resource development combine so that suicide rates are 5 to 6 times higher in First Nations communities than elsewhere. It is a never-ending struggle for parents and children alike. Above, on the ceiling in the room in which I slept, were the words, "Give me something worth living for. Anything to keep me breathing." Although KI has both an addiction treatment center and group home, lack of funding has meant that there is no follow-up, and they often find the same people coming round and round again, because once they complete treatment, they often return to the same issues in their homes. New slide, please. It has been 5 years since Prime Minister Harper's apology to Aboriginal people in Canada for all the pain and suffering that they endured at residential schools. About 150,000 Native children went through the residential school system here. Next slide, please. Common belief is that it will take 7 to 10 generations to repair the emotional and cultural damage inflicted. The damage didn't occur overnight, and the solution will not be immediate or simple. But just hoping it will go away is not a solution. Next slide, please. The Aboriginal people are patient and willing to work towards solutions, and just at this time I would like to read you part of a letter to the editor by James Sinclair, who is an Aboriginal working for the Native Studies Department at the University of Manitoba. I want to give you something, a gift, a story maybe, a piece of our home. I offer this in the way I would bring food to a feast. I give this so that you might know a little about the land where you and I now reside. I give this so that we might find a way to live together meaningfully in the vision established by the agreement that made this place. This is a treaty that, while never fulfilled, promises mutual benefit, non-interference, and peace. I believe that we are more than the words and images we have inherited. I know that we can make a better home than this, that we can expect more of ourselves if we are brave, honest, and if we listen. It is time we give each other gifts of responsibility. I ask you to be more than the words we have inherited. And I ask you to talk, share food, discuss how we can be more. You have said that you are not ready, That's okay. Change is difficult. I am ready. I will wait for you. Our home is too important. Next slide, please. The leaders and the young people who we met this week in KI have heard James Sinclair's call to action, and they've invited us into their daily lives. They're inspiring in their potential as future leaders and creators of hope in their community. Since we are all treaty people, we cannot in good conscience ignore their message and deflate their hope. It was a highly successful week in KI, an extraordinary experience thanks to the incredible hard work of all these young people and the support that their elders gave them. It is our time to step up and take some action now. Our First Nations study group has put together a petition to the House of Commons in Ottawa, which addresses these issues and the huge alarming gap in funding by the federal government for housing, infrastructure, child welfare, all the things we've been talking about. You must be asking some of you, why a petition? Everybody's got petitions going. Well, we believe that after having spoken with our local members of Parliament, that Ottawa will not take any serious action on these issues until it begins to see that, in fact, Aboriginal issues are a concern of non-Aboriginal Canadians. Treaties were signed between First Nations and the Government of Canada. People of First Nations should not have to bear this struggle alone. We too have a responsibility to ensure that our obligations and duties under the treaties are upheld by our government representatives. A petition which shows that non-Aboriginal Canadians consider these issues to be important enough that would affect their voting will certainly put pressure on the government to do the right thing and give equal funding. It shouldn't be a two-tiered system in Canada for anybody. Everybody should have equal rights. And we believe our petition will help to do this. And the plan is that we will take it beyond this church to other churches. We've had initial discussions with the Caring Alliance in Scarborough and Kairos Canada and other groups. We're asking that the petitions come back to our church for the Thanksgiving weekend, October 11th, the beginning of that weekend. We thought that would be very appropriate because it's the Native people who first enabled the early settlers to actually experience and have a Thanksgiving. We will then gather the petitions up and we will take them to Ottawa and meet with our MP, Mr. Chizu, whose idea was to start this petition. We thought it only fair that he be the person to read it in Parliament when it's sitting. So I'll just go over the what the petition is calling on the House to do. To lift the 2% cap on annual increases to Aboriginal Affairs core programs, which has been in place since 1996. To reverse the 15% or $1.2 billion cut to the 2015-2016 Aboriginal Affairs budget, which was reported recently in the Globe and Mail. To increase federal funding for Aboriginal housing, potable water, primary and secondary education, child and family services, health and social programs, and other basic needs to a level that attains equality in the provision of government services between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in Canada, and to uphold our duties and obligations as treaty people. And so I ask you to take a moment before leaving today to visit with Steve and Dorothy in the lobby at the table. They'll have the petitions there and they will be happy to answer any questions you may have. Miigwech, thank you. That's not quite the reflection we had in mind. We wanted to think about what moves you from reflection to action. What would motivate that change in your outlook?